Widespread protests and strikes across Israel appear to have worked, at least in the short term. CP24's Jamie Goodfroin joins us live with the latest. Why do they appear to have worked? What's happening?
Well, right now we just heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that he's going to be taking a timeout, suspend the second and third reading of these sweeping judicial reforms. With more on what's happening in Israel, I want to bring in Noah Shack, the VP of the GTA for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us on CP24, Noah. You know, on any given time, Israeli politics could be described as volatile and even dysfunctional at times, but what's happening is obviously quite significant. Talk to me a little bit about how these reforms is threatening democracy in Israel.
Well, a new Israeli government was elected a few months ago that has rapidly pushed ahead with a series of significant reforms to Israel's judiciary. There's been broad consensus that some form of judicial reform is needed in Israel, but the nature, scope, and pace of the government's agenda has generated polarization and discord. Both sides of the debate will assert that democracy hangs in the balance and would be harmed if the judicial reform legislation passes or if it fails to pass. The call coming now from both opposition and government sides for a pause in the legislative process is the right thing to do, and I'm glad the government of Israel has confirmed today it'll do so. This should allow time for all stakeholders to negotiate a better path forward toward the broadest possible consensus. After all, democracy is about so much more than votes at the ballot box. Elections matter, but governments need to be responsive to a whole society. It'll be important now for both government and opposition factions in Israel to engage in good faith so that all segments of Israeli society feel part of the public policy process moving forward. You know, Israel was founded on the principle of inclusion, and it needs to always reaffirm this value, particularly today.
You know, Noah, the Prime Minister says he's taking a pause to the reform through dialogue. You're seeing these, unprecedented mass protests playing out. Even military reservists are saying publicly that they won't even serve a country that is veering toward autocracy. What do you think that says about the nation right now? And also, do you think, does that put Israel's security at risk if reservists and military personnel are saying that we might not even serve if you take this route?
Well, Yoav Gallant, who until yesterday was Israel's Minister of Defense, certainly thought so and was concerned about the possible implications of what you just mentioned. But I think it's really important in the broader context to recognize that Israel is a thriving democracy. I saw reports that yesterday around 6% of its population was in the streets demonstrating. That's roughly equivalent to more than 2 million Canadians immediately taking to the streets spontaneously to raise their voices on an issue. It's a tremendous civic engagement in Israel. It's very impressive. Imagine 2 million Canadians going out into the streets, proudly waving Canadian flags and singing "O Canada" to make their voices heard on a matter like judicial reform. Today, there's a broad general strike led by labor unions, universities, and private corporations. This includes the unionized staff at Israel's diplomatic missions abroad, including here in Canada, in Ottawa and Toronto, which are closed today. So whatever comes next in terms of the judicial reform in Israel, in terms of what process unfolds during this period of pause, the outpouring of spirited civic engagement, love of country and democracy in action that we're seeing is something that's very special.
This has clearly united the country. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of people protest through Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. But I want to get your take on this. You know, the government has labeled a lot of these protesters as anarchists out to topple a democratically elected leadership. What do you make of that?
Look, I think that at a time like this, polarized politics doesn't help anyone. Now is a time during this pause in the legislative agenda to bring people together, to get people around the table, and to try to achieve the broadest possible consensus on this important issue. Coming into this last legislative session, there was broad recognition that some sort of judicial reform was necessary in Israel. The question isn't about whether there needs to be reform, it's what shape that should take. And that seems to me to be a basis for bringing people together rather than driving them apart. And I'm hopeful that that's what this process will produce.
Noah Shack, VP of GTA for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. We appreciate your time and your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.